Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Tom Rosenstiel. Tom started out at the LA Times as media critic, spent some time at Newsweek, eventually came together with Bill Kovach and created a Project for Excellence in Journalism. For the last 16 years, he has been at the Project for Excellence in Journalism in conjunction with the Pew Charitable Trust. Done so much research. I've referenced him in my work probably at least 50 times. I'm sure many of you in the room have done the same. So the State of the Media report, which is coming out, I guess, in the next few weeks, will be the 10th such report. In 2008, Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel received a Missouri Medal for their work with the Project for Excellence in Journalism. So we've been very fortunate to have been associated with that work for some time now. Tom has just taken a new job. He is Executive Director of American Press Institute. So he has been visiting with us for the last day and a half, talking about how he can do some partnership research work with folks at the Missouri School and with Reynolds Journalism Institute. Today he's going to talk to us about where the news audience is taking journalism. So welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Esther. Is this working? Good. I'm really thrilled and flattered to be here. This is a school I really admire, and there are so many people at the school who I really like that it's a special pleasure to be here. And I've met a couple of new people in the last 2 days, and I really like them too. So I don't know what you got going on here, Dean, but. I met Esther about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and we started making mischief together, and haven't done it as much in the last couple of years, but being at API gives me an opportunity for us to make a lot more mischief together, which I'm looking forward to. And I want to thank Dean, who I've known and admired for a very long time, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that he allowed people to eat in this room today. Which is, I know, why so many people showed up. And that was a good little strategy. Okay, so what I'm going to do from the next bit is talk about where the audience is going. And the reason I want to talk about this is because that's where journalism is going to go. We live in a user-controlled media world now. They decide, we decide, and so it's really important to understand where the audience is going. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to do two things, and it's probably too much. I probably packed too much into this talk, but it's a journalism school, so you're used to lectures that are overcomplicated, right? First, I'm going to tell you 5 things about the data about audiences that people usually get wrong. 5 things that are myths or that mistakes that people usually make. And then I'm going to, at the end of that, step back and kind of infer 5 new ideas that I think will help you as particularly the students here, because you guys are going to, by the way, invent the next journalism. Your professors are going to help you, hopefully, but you're going to do this. So here's what everyone knows about the audience. The internet's going up. TV over time is tracking downward. Big steep drop in the early 90s as cable went from 1 channel to 3. Radio is tracking down. Read a newspaper tracking down all over time. But here's what people forget when they see those numbers. This is the first mistake. Platforms are not sources. So when you say you go to the internet, it doesn't actually tell you where you're getting your information from. It just tells you what the delivery system is. So let's look at that chart again. Got news online digitally, up from 24 to 39, heading towards television land. But sorting out where people are getting that information online is extremely difficult to do. And it's harder and harder all the time because the metrics are a mess. The numbers that might track online activity probably don't track mobile phones. Getting digital in there is not, getting tablets in there is complicated. The measuring agencies, if you looked under their skirt, you would discover that they didn't have max in their profile for years and years, and have just started to add max, and the numbers aren't adequate there. So if you ask people on surveys, what was the source of this information, that's a hard thing for people to remember. Okay. Here's mistake number 2 that people often make, or myth number 2. With more and more choices in a user-controlled world, the young don't get news. Well, actually, it's the opposite is true. By various measures, people are getting more news today than they used to. This is New York Times data that shows that 25% of people said they get more news than they used to, 10% say less, a net of 15. Now let's go to mobile. The net is 24. Non-mobile, it's 8. Mobile is having a huge impact on news consumption. And mobile news consumers really, really skew young. 75% of people under age 50 are online on mobile devices versus 30% over age 50. I've got other data which is not in the slide deck that I was just looking at this week. I mean, we were talking about 18 to 30 as avid news consumers on mobile. Okay, mobile will further hurt attention spans and further erode the impact of traditional news brands. Actually, the data suggests the opposite. Mobile is driving people to familiar brands more than computers did. And tablets, in particular, are getting people to read long form on digital for the first time. Okay, so why is mobile helping old brands? Well, you can thank Steve Jobs for this. Steve Jobs decided that mobile would be touchscreen based. On touchscreen, people go through search less, and they go to icons and apps and bookmarks more. And the data is from various different sources is quite clear on this. The other thing, how many of you have heard the term lean back media experience and lean forward media experience? Is this something you talk about here? Okay. Old media, lean back. You're sitting on the sofa and the TV happens to you. I won't quote my old film professor from college who put it more colorfully about what the film did to you. But newspaper, lean back experience. You're interacting with one medium, one news organization, one outlet at a time. When we got to the desktop and even the laptop era, it was what scholars called a lean forward experience. You're looking for the answer to your question. You're in search. You're hunting for the links that look like the answer to your question. The tablet, and to some extent the phone, but particularly the tablet, have brought back a lean back experience to digital for the first time. Designers are saying, when they design apps for the tablet, that it is not an experience, as Steve Jobs predicted, that is between the computer and the smartphone. It's actually a technology that's somewhere between the computer and a print publication. You touch it, you turn pages, you're in, and because the way the apps are designed and because the way the structure is designed, you are doing one thing at a time. Whereas on a computer, you're doing many things. The email comes flying in. It's actually the perfect multitasking device. Please do not drive with your laptop on your lap. So mobile, how many 2.0s have we had with the internet now? Are we on like 2.07? But I think you can argue that mobile is really a substantial 2.0 moment. 54% of people own a smartphone now. That's up 60% in 4 years. 3 years. 31% own a tablet. That's up 24% from 6 months ago. The youth of the mobile technology audience means it's only going to grow. Now, 70% of people in America have a computer. That number really hasn't changed in about 5 years. Mobile is going to surpass it in the US in the next couple of years, people predict. Here's mistake number 4. We're almost done with our mistakes. Everyone, especially the young, now get all their media, all their news from places that they agree with, and especially social media. Nobody goes to agenda-setting media sources anymore. Well, social's growing rapidly. It really is. But it's not like it's the whole world. Online, digitally, 39% of people say that they get news online digitally, but 19% in 2012 said they did it from social media. Now, I'm sure those numbers are going to grow rapidly. Certainly have in my life. But the notion that somehow this has replaced all of the media consumption is not true. And as we'll see in a minute, it's not as though these things are exclusive to other devices. Remember the distinction between platform and source. So when people say I get most of my breaking news from Twitter, that doesn't mean that Twitter is actually reporting the news for them. Mistake number 5, new platforms are cannibalizing the old. That Twitter is a threat somehow to the New York Times or to the Missourian or anything else. It's just not that simple. There's more and more research that suggests that new and old platforms are interdependent in interesting ways. I think of this as, I put quotes around this morning, a cycle of news discovery. What does that mean? This comes from New York Times data that they did last year. Half of people first hear about a breaking news from television. I suspect Twitter is going to take a big chunk of that in time. It's only at 1% in 2012. But more than 8 in 10 then follow the story going to a second source. Okay, you hear about something, you want to know more, then you go to places that you trust, that have been helpful to you in the past, that may not be the place that alerted you to it. And 51% went to a different platform. So I heard about it on my smartphone, but I actually went to a different device, a different platform to find out more. Online, 6 out of 10 of these people went to legacy news sites as their second source. Places that they knew, places that had served them well in the past. And the other thing that the data show is that news consumers are loyal across platforms. You like the New York Times, you bookmark it on every one of your gadgets. You like the Missourian, you like TMZ, come on, I know you do. You bookmark it on all your platforms. Because otherwise you can't even remember what's on them. Okay, so those are the 5 mistakes. How will you, the young people in this room, invent the next journalism to meet this new audience? Now here are my 5 ideas that I hope will help you. The first one is, the medium is not the message. Marshall McLuhan's famous line, the medium is the message, the medium dictates what we learn. I think he's wrong. I think the story is the message. The nature of the event and where we are in the arc of that story breaking dictate where we go to get news. It's a user-controlled world. So when the planes hit the tower, the World Trade Center, we watch it on TV. It's something you want to see on TV. When there's a presidential debate, the people who are interested in it want to actually see it on TV. You want to see him say, "Binders full of women." During the snowstorm in New York, Instagram was such a good place to see pictures because 1 million people were taking their pictures and posting them, that the New York Times took what was on Instagram, curated it, and put that on the New York Times website. That was the best slideshow of the snowstorm, citizens taking pictures. The hurricane, Sandy, was breaking on Twitter because it's the fastest way to get news reports. I finally got Mitt Romney. I finally felt like I understood him after I read that profile in the New Yorker. I never really fully got the mentality of the NRA until I had a long talk with my neighbor who's an NRA member. What you want to know dictates where you go because we have the ability to go so many places. So remember the cycle of discovery of news. It depends on what people want to know and where we are in the arc of the story. What is it that's missing? What is it that you don't understand? What is it that you need to know to have the tumblers click next on this event or this story or this question? That's going to determine which platform where you end up. Yes, some of us are more inclined to do certain things than others, but the notion, and there's more data on this, the notion that we go to one place, that we get most of our news from X is obsolete, which is a real challenge when you look also at the old survey questions, which always were kind of based that way. So that's idea number one. The story is the message. It dictates what you're curious about, dictates where you go. Idea number two, each platform is a different tool and more than a competing one. Every technology has its own strengths and its own weaknesses. The convenience of this is incredible, right? But it's harder to read long stuff on it. This is a creation device, which is great. Maybe not as convenient as this to carry around. In television, they used to talk about how television is an emotional medium. And so people would tell stories. You'd like to see people cry, and it's better at conveying the feelings about stories. Radio is a great medium for storytelling because the pictures in your head is kind of a nice melding of print. Print, my old medium, was great for stuffing facts into stories. We weren't always the best storytellers, but boy, we could really cram the data into those stories. Now, this doesn't mean that we should submit to just being prisoners of the weaknesses of each medium. In fact, the best journalists I ever met were people who knew how to work against the predilections of a medium. They could make a TV story both emotional and informational. They didn't just sort of go with the flow. But we have to be aware, as there are more choices, that each of these platforms, each of these mediums, has different strengths and weaknesses. Instagram versus Twitter, the tablet versus the web versus the phone, video versus audio, data visualization versus interactivity, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine that when we were in a print world, we had 6 elements that you could use in your storytelling. There was the headline, the narrative, maybe a sidebar, a graphic, a map. In the digital age, those 6 elements are, the last time I made this list, it was about 60. It was a couple years ago. It's probably 160 maybe that you can imagine. So your challenge as the next generation of news producers is to know which tool fits which job. Something that my generation never really had to think about. Let the story and its arc determine the tools you use. Easier said than done, right? Your problem, not mine, maybe? I don't know. But it means that these things are tools. You're not going to be a print journalist. You're not going to be a video journalist. or if you are, you're going to be more limited. Your journalism should use them all. Long form and short form. What we're discovering is that people use these at one time of day. They use a tablet at another time of day. The kind of news you deliver to people is going to be different depending on when and how they use it. So this may be a more iterative delivery platform for news. People are discovering that since people use tablets between 5 and 11 at night, that's the time the tablet usage is heaviest, that maybe our tablet apps are supposed to deliver news that is for an evening period when people have already heard the headlines and are supposed to go deeper. We're going to know these things about the audience going forward. So the journalism that you create has got to reflect how the audience uses them. It used to be, when I came into this business, that the consumer had to adapt their behavior to fit the medium, or to fit the media. The news came on at 6:30, so I had to be home. Today, the media has to adapt its behavior to meet the need of the consumer. And this goes to another kind of big idea. The next journalism is not a product, it's a service. It's how do you answer audience questions? How do you serve the community? Its function is not just stories and advertising, it's social connectivity. But it's always been that. We just didn't really think of it that way, right? We thought of it as, well, I write stories and we sell ads against them. But in the 19th century, innovative publishers were inventing classified ads and comics and letters to the editor. Today, people are inventing Yelp and AutoTrader and realestate.com and Angie's List and a document cloud and all kinds of new things. Some of these things are not being innovated by people in the journalism world, which is one of the challenges. So as you think about the next journalism, the one you're going to invent, you'll invent new ways to connect. Storify, invented at the Knight Journalism Fellowship. Instagram, new apps, new ways to tell narratives, new ways to tell stories better, new, more convenient ways to reach citizens. But being the old guy, I would add one other thing. No matter what, there are two things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to write, and you need to be able to think. Data visualization isn't of any use if you haven't understood what that data is saying, simplified it, and be able to convey in a few words what the point is. That's an intellectual discipline, not a platform discipline. Almost done. Number 4, technology is an opportunity. It's not a threat. And this concept of journalism as service rather than a static product, the technology is the opportunity to create more ways of doing that service better. Those who look at the technology and think, oh God, not a new thing, I just can't keep up, they are doomed to lose in this world to the people who see the value of the technology. There's a guy named John Gardner who created Common Cause and a number of other social innovations, created Medicare, one of the really important people of the 20th century. He said, the future belongs to people who believe in the future. You have to be an optimist at this moment in media, because who would want to follow anybody else? Last idea. News, and I've already kind of said this, spoiler alert, news has to adapt to people's behavior, not the other way around. People consume news differently depending on the device. They consume news differently different times a day, but they also don't do the same thing anymore. So it's interesting when you again look at the audience data, what you see is, if you ask people what did they do yesterday, those numbers are down a lot more. If you ask people what they did in the last week, those numbers are more stable. Why? Because what's disappearing is not the newspaper reader, it's the 7-day-a-week newspaper reader in print. Because other days you do other things, You're still getting the news, but you're adapting your news consumption to what's going on in your life. So your journalism has to match that. And it means that at 9 in the morning you may post 3 sentences about something, and at 5 in the afternoon you might write a longer piece and treatment of it. And that's, I already talked about optimism. There's just no better time to be you. There's just no better time to be in journalism school. When I was in journalism school in 1980, sorry. Really all we were trying to do was figure out how do we follow in the footsteps of the people, of our elders. What are they doing? How do we emulate it? It was almost like a Ciceronian way of learning. And Cicero learned to write by literally writing the words that great writers of the past had written. And through osmosis, he would learn to write that way, kind of unthinkingly, like repetition in sports. That's almost what we did, like matched our feet to the footprints of others. You guys are going to invent a new journalism and maybe own it. It's an extraordinarily exciting time. And because these tools, instead of a hammer and a saw and a screwdriver, you've got all the power tools of Home Depot to create the next journalism. It will be better than what my generation could ever have dreamed of. But it's going to be more chaotic. It's going to be a lot more like a big dinner party than my little talk has been. So I'm done. I hope there's some questions.
You talk about ways we can improve the media, like we are going to have a better future. What ways do you think the media is not connecting with the audience today, or ways it could improve?
Well, I've been thinking about something that you might almost call a war on journalists that has occurred. The political right has derided journalists. To some extent, the digerati have derided journalists for being too old-fashioned, derided concepts like objectivity, which I view as meaning more transparency than objectivity. When I was still a working journalist, there was a movement called civic journalism or public journalism that came along, which complained that journalists were disconnected. And there were responses to civic journalism like, well, we should put our email or our phone number at the bottom of our stories so people could actually call us and talk to us. This seems very crude now, but one paper was innovative in that it made everybody at the paper serve on the customer service desk for a week each year, so that you had to deal with the public. Just sort of get news people to be somewhat responsive. Well, technology has just eradicated that problem. I mean, you're engaged or you're not employed basically anymore. So on some level, the notion that the media and journalists are not sufficiently engaged with the public is much less the problem than whether the journalism we're creating for them understands how they live their lives. But it's very popular these days to say, oh my God, the New York Times is completely out of step. That's not my view of this. There's stuff in the New York Times that every day that I think, man, you can't find this anywhere else. And in the Washington Post and in the supposedly threatened or dying incumbent media, they're doing a job that isn't replicated other places. One other idea, and this is kind of stealing from Nick Lemon at Columbia, if you think about the structural change in the media world, the discussion part of the media culture is exploding. It's getting much, much, much larger. And the repertorial component of the media culture is shrinking. But that cycle of discovery that I talked about always begins with reporting. with somebody finding out something new. Now, some of that reporting is simply showing up and bearing witness and explaining what's going on, and some of it is deep enterprise, and we need both. And people will always blame the messenger. Does that mean that the press is doing nothing wrong? No, but the rep is worse than. And one other thing on this. This is a long answer. We did something different at Pew last year. The last time we asked the trust questions. The trust questions have always been, when you think of the media, what do you think they're trustworthy? Are they accurate? There's a whole battery of questions. So last time we did it, maybe 2 years ago, we said, when you think of the media, who are you thinking of? And the number one answer that came back was cable news. Liberals, Democrats said Fox, Republicans said CNN and MSNBC. They thought of something they didn't like. Then we re-asked the question, if you thinking about the media that you use most often, how do you feel about the same battery questions? Okay, so on get the facts right, you ask the media about the media, 60% say usually get the facts wrong, 30% said usually get the facts right. When we asked the media you use most often, the numbers exactly reversed. 60% said get the facts right, 30% said usually get the facts wrong. Then we asked, what do you think of when you think of the media that you use most often? Oh, it was almost always the local, some local paper, local TV, something that was more tied to community.
Is this for karaoke? Because I can do feelings. Going back to the 5 matters that you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of those have sort of become conventional wisdom. And I'm wondering how much of that, the fact that it's become conventional wisdom, is because the industry has tended to listen a little too much to hucksters. It's like Y2K. The reason there was so much pearl-clutching over Y2K is that nobody realized that everybody who was beating the drum the loudest for that was selling a solution to it. And a lot of these seem like the same sort of things. Is that a factor in what has made this conventional wisdom? We're just listening to too many salesmen?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's probably part of it. And the people who are energized by what the new technology can do are extremely enthusiastic, and they're, they just see an unfolding world. And then, you see the financial aspects of this are significant. I mean, this is a real disruption on the financial side. Newspapers have lost half their ad revenue in less than a decade, and that does tend to make one a little down in the mouth if you work in that business. I think the other part of it is, and so they're looking for solutions and they're listening to whoever says, I've got solutions. And boy, in the time I've been in this business, there were a lot of hucksters. But, the difference between a huckster and a visionary may be just how things turn out, right?
A huckster is the visionary who has the patent.
Yeah, right. That's good. The other thing is, it's really hard there are scholars in this room. I won't point them out, to protect their anonymity, but it's really hard when things are changing this fast then to measure things properly. So, where are you getting your news? That's a hard one to answer. People can't remember very accurately the metrics. I mean, there was a piece in Adweek this week about how the industry effort that has been going on for 2 years to standardize the metrics for measuring websites seems to have fallen apart. So these are really serious problems for the industry kind of finding its footing across any of these platforms. It's hard to know what the audience is doing if you can't even figure out what do you mean by unique visitor.
Thank you. I appreciate your optimism, and I totally share it, that we're going to invent the next journalism, and it's going to be fabulous and better than ever. My question is, we're also mostly, as we graduate, going to be getting jobs working for people rather than starting our own things. So what advice do you have about how to work within an existing system and bring new ideas, get traction on innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's easier actually than it was because these companies value new people and new ideas a lot more than they used to. It's easier, I mean, there are fewer jobs, but it is easier to get jobs at significant places than it was when I came out of school. I mean, it was, you know, it's nice to meet you. You have to go 4 markets down before I'll talk to you and put in 6, 7, 8 years. You know, it's 3 stops to get to a national media organization. And when in 1992 I said to the Times Mirror company where I worked, I'd really like to get involved in thinking about new technology, they said, we really need you to just do your beat. You know, we're not that interested in new technology. So that's a change. You know, people are working very hard, and you know, this may be a sort of a nights and weekends kind of obsession if you really have a new idea. But Esther and I were talking about this. I was part of a group that helped the Knight Foundation, or helped the Knight Fellowship at Stanford rethink that fellowship program. These fellowship programs, for those of you who don't know, were generally invented to take people who were sort of slotted for bigger things inside a news company, have them go away for a year, and they'd come back. The idea that was they'd come back to their where they worked, and they'd, you know, sort of be groomed for bigger things. Although it always often worked out that these people then left where they went. The original fellowship at Neiman was actually designed to expose the blue-collar, unwashed, uneducated journalists to a year at Harvard. Maybe they'd get a little enlightenment and their journalism wouldn't suck so bad. That was in the 1930s. But the model at the Knight Fellowship at Stanford was sort of running aground. People were going on their fellowship and then getting laid off while they weren't there, you know, weren't in their job. So they had to rethink it. And the idea that we came up with was, it used to be that you'd apply for this and you'd say, I'm not going to do anything in particular in my year at Stanford. That's the minute. You cannot be working on a book. You cannot be, so you'd go and you'd speak to them and they'd all show up with their tennis rackets and, you know, running clothes for the lecture or whatever. We changed it. The idea we came up with was, come up with a question that you want to answer that will change journalism for the better, and we're going to pick you to be a fellow based on the quality of this, what they called the quest that you were after. So, I mean, it's just one example, and this is, I don't mean to sound Pollyannish about it, because your employer is going to really want you to do your job. That's what they're paying you for. But there's certainly this idea that the audience is changing, and if you can figure out new ways to reach them, they do want to listen.
The news out of Google is retail stores by, you know, the end of the year, they're saying, and part of the reason is the Google glasses. Mm-hmm. They're not going to sell those things unless people can try them before they buy them. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you've seen, you maybe not have seen any data on this, but I'm curious if you think that will be a lean back or a lean forward experience, and how might that
let me look that up.
Change, yeah, how that might change what we do and how we do it.
Well, there's this concept that I've been hearing about in the last few months. Since I switched jobs, I'm sort of more in touch with business people in this world than I was before. So that one of the concepts that they're talking about is what they call the path to purchase. How is it people discover something and decide whether they want to buy it? And I was just at this conference in New York, and the old model was this funnel. You'd become aware, and it would drill down to making a purchase decision. And now the graphs of how this happens is like 45 dots and lines all over a page, and it says the path to purchase is nonlinear and unique for every person. That sounds pretty daunting. So Google is saying, okay, we need to create stores, but there's new research from ComScore out that shows that what people are doing now is they're in the store and they're saying, well, that's an interesting looking thing. I wonder how much it costs at some other store. Or I wonder how much it costs online. So the stores are actually going to have to compete directly in real time with with the internet. So I think there may be stores, but they may also be real-time pricing in the sense that you say, look, I can get it for this on this gizmo. Will you sell it for me for this price? I suspect Esther, if she weren't at the journalism school, would be studying the hell out of this optimal pricing, with this dual sort of online, offline dual experience, and but this is also that fluidity in shopping is hardly anything new. I remember in the 1980s, and you probably went to some of these conferences, where people were talking about the end of the department store. A department store was a store where you go where they have everything. And they would have a big inventory, and the longer something sat on the shelf, the more you discount the price because it was taking up space. And that was dying, and it was giving way to the big box store, which was, everything's on sale all the time, lowest price every day. But these box stores were just for electronics or just for that.
And boutique stores at the other.
Right. So the notion that retailing is being revolutionized has been a constant in my adult life. And when Apple opened the Apple Store, Gateway had tried to open Gateway stores, and they were total flop. And Apple succeeded, and Gateways didn't. And so the other thing is, at the local level, at the really local level, it's not as digitized. It's just not as digital a world. I think it will become so. But if you want to buy tires for your car, you actually have to go someplace where they put them on your car.
So speaking of purchasing, I was at an analytics seminar last week with a bunch of marketers. And it's fascinating to me that they all knew on their websites exactly what they wanted people to do. There's like a thank you for purchasing page or some sort of conversion rate that they were tracking over time. And journalists just don't exist, especially the editorial side of journalism, in a culture of measurement. Yeah. We tend to want more audience. We want them to spend more time. We want them to visit more pages. We want more new visitors and more returning visitors. Thank you very much. Right. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about what you wish we would be measuring or what the goals even are.
Yeah. We were talking about this this morning, right? So one of the huge challenges, and I think news people need to be in the middle of this fight, is how do you sustain and even embolden your journalistic values when you can measure the traffic? How do you sustain or embolden your journalistic values when in a world of universal measurement, especially when the metrics suck? Well, here's what one paper is doing. That's run by a Harvard business professor in Salt Lake. They said, okay, we've got, this is the Deseret News, we have certain topics that are part of our franchise brand that really reflect values, and we want to do enterprise journalism on that. So on their webpage, there's a rubric, and they say there will always be X many deep enterprise stories on the page. They also know that if they picked just the most popular stories and put them on the page, they would be entirely 100% BYU sports. So they say there can only be X number of sports stories on the page. And so this rubric says, these are our values. we're going to have this many enterprise stories, this many stories on this topic, certain number of sports stories, et cetera, a certain number of stories that are socially engaged. And then they have spots on the page where they know these things should be, and they also know what the traffic is for any particular time of day. So when they measure the popularity of a deep enterprise story, they're measuring it against the average behavior of other deep enterprise stories that are on that spot on the page, and they know what the average traffic should be at any given time of day, knowing that it's better at some times a day for those kinds of stories and not at others. And they know what the average is. It's a rolling average. It's added to in real time all the time. So they can judge the performance of things against like-minded things. Sports stories, same, against other sports stories. I'm not saying that this is the ideal way of doing it, but they have imposed a set of judgments that inform the metrics and control the metrics, as opposed to what happened in local television, where they said, oh, our minute-to-minutes are going down, no more, and that was a political story. Ergo, we infer that political stories can't be on television. So this is a matter of use the metrics to help your journalism. And that means that as news people, you need to get familiar with these things, comfortable with these things. I did it, and I can barely do algebra. So there's no doubt you guys can do it. And it also means that you need to know what matters. This is not you need to know what it is your news organization is going to be good at. What are the things you're going to own? What are the things that really matter? Because we're also in a world where you just can't cover everything equally well. This is one of the challenges of the internet. The internet rewards places that are really good at one thing. Open tables, a great way to get restaurant reservations. The newspaper and the television model and the radio model was we're sort of competent at everything. So now news organizations in this very crowded media environment have to figure what are the things that we're really going to be good at, and then how do we deal with the with somewhat less of our resources, all the other things. And then you can start to build how to measure that. It's so easy to solve these problems when you're just philosophizing.
I work for a local TV station in town, and we've been pushing mobile for the last couple of years, but I know the profits haven't followed. How do you think companies are going to deal with making money on mobile if that's where it's going? And a second question is, how far, Intel's come out with it, the Apple TV, how far away are we from consumers programming their own TV and losing the cable subscription bundles?
Yeah, right. So that's two good questions. How to monetize mobile? Nobody knows. Really, nobody knows. And I was at this local online advertising conference earlier this week, and nobody knows. They just know mobile's growing by leaps and bounds. What I hear is from people in this space is it'll be a post-advertising marketplace, meaning, as Seth Godin, who writes a lot of books about this stuff, said, if after hearing my talk, you think the solution is finding a better banner ad for your mobile phone, then you haven't understood anything I just said. It's not going to be ads in the way that we think of them. It will be other things, like information where you can actually make a purchase. It will be things that will help you do what you're doing, rather than, oh, gee, I see, they sell this here. It's got to be more useful than that. Now, how much money will you be able to get from that? It's a little hard nobody really knows. I also think mobile is going to be more important for local media than national. One of the other things I heard at this conference, which really stuck out in my mind, was local is all about walking around, and that's what mobile's good for. So if you're at the New York Times, if you're reading the New York Times, this may not be something where you say, oh, I really want to buy something right now. You may not be on your phone, or if you're on your phone, it may not be in a kind of retail-like context. but in local it could be a lot more. But people have not sorted this out. And your second question was about TV. Okay, so I was at an event about 5 years ago, and the head of Geek Squad, the guy who started Geek Squad, said, "You see this? In the future, there will be 3 versions of this. This size, and this one that hangs on your wall. And they'll all be the same machine. But how you touch them will be different. How you make them work will be different." So there's just no question that that when the interface with a television that's really a computer hanging on your wall works, it's a better way to watch television, right? You don't have to wait. You're not limited to what's in the DVR, and you don't have to wait for Tuesday night. You don't have to say, "Oh shoot, they took that down already." People talk about the show that Netflix just produced, House of Cards, and they say, "Well, this is really an experiment in how much people want to watch, every episode in a weekend." Not as far as I'm concerned. It's an experiment in can you begin to see Netflix as a network, as a producer. I think it's very possible. I think it's almost a certainty that at some point in the future, if Hulu survives, people will say, "Did you know that NBC once owned Hulu rather than the other way around?" I just think it's inevitable because it's a more convenient way for the consumer to get what they want. I mean, that's the one thing we should have learned by now, right? It's the consumers. What works for the consumer is going to determine this. You getting the hook?
And we'd like to thank you so much for sharing these ideas with us.